You know what's truly remarkable about human nature? I discovered something that could save millions of lives, reveal broken bones without cutting flesh, and transform medicine forever. And the first thing people worried about was whether I could see through their underwear. January 1896, just 2 months after I announced my discovery of X-rays, newspapers around the world were screaming headlines about death rays, invisible photography, and the end of human privacy. The London Standard declared I had found a way to photograph the human soul. The New York World claimed my rays could see through everything. And suddenly, everyone on Earth was terrified of a physics professor from a small German university. I had accidentally stumbled upon invisible radiation that could pass through solid matter. What I didn't anticipate was that this discovery would unleash something far more powerful and unpredictable than X-rays themselves: mass hysteria. Fear spreads faster than light, and ignorance travels at the speed of panic. Let me tell you how my simple scientific observation nearly caused a worldwide crisis of faith in reality itself. December 28, 1895. I submitted my paper Über eine neue Art von Strahlen on a new kind of rays to the Würzburg Physical Medical Society. It was 8 pages long, written in dry academic German, filled with careful measurements and cautious conclusions. I thought maybe a few physicists would find it interesting. I was catastrophically wrong. Within days, my paper was being translated into every major language on Earth. Telegraph lines hummed with news of the German professor who could see through solid objects. But somewhere between my laboratory and the printing presses of the world, scientific discovery transformed into sensational horror story. The problem wasn't what I had discovered. The problem was what people imagined I had discovered. See, when you tell someone you've found invisible rays that can pass through wood, paper, and flesh, their mind immediately leaps to the most dramatic implications. They don't think about medical applications or scientific principles. They think about privacy, about danger, about the fundamental assumptions of reality being violated. And the newspapers. They understood exactly what sells papers. It's not German physicist makes modest discovery with potential medical applications. It's death rays discovered, invisible force can see through anything. The London Standard, January 13th, 1896. The new photography promises to revolutionize the art of war, surgery, and may produce a new cure for bashfulness. They were making jokes about bashfulness while simultaneously terrifying people about military applications. The New York World went further. Hidden solids revealed. The Röntgen rays show the bones in the living body, coins in the purse, the lead in the gun barrel. Notice how they connected medical imaging directly to finding weapons. That wasn't accidental. But my personal favorite was from a German satirical magazine that proclaimed, "Professor Röntgen has discovered rays which can photograph through wooden doors and metal safes. Now we must reconsider our entire legal system, for how can we maintain privacy when nothing can remain hidden?" This is where things got genuinely concerning. Because while I was sitting in my laboratory trying to understand the physics of electromagnetic radiation, the world was convincing itself that I had essentially invented magic. The fear manifested in 3 distinct waves of panic, each more irrational than the last. Wave 1 was the privacy panic. Within weeks of my announcement, I received hundreds of letters from concerned citizens asking whether X-rays could see through clothing. This wasn't scientific curiosity, this was existential terror. Victorian society was built on layers of fabric, propriety, and hidden modesty. The idea that invisible rays could penetrate these barriers struck at the very foundation of social order. A British member of Parliament stood up in the House of Commons and demanded to know whether the government planned to regulate the indecent use of Röntgen photography, as if I had invented some sort of voyeuristic telescope rather than a medical imaging technique. American newspapers reported that Röntgen photography was being banned from opera houses because ladies feared their undergarments might be visible to men with special viewing devices. This was completely ridiculous. You needed a photographic plate, 15 minutes of exposure time, and a high-voltage electrical apparatus. But fear doesn't require logic. One American company even began advertising X-ray-proof underwear made with lead-lined fabric. I wish I were making this up, but entrepreneurial minds will always find ways to profit from public anxiety. The truth is, my X-rays couldn't produce the kind of detailed imagery people feared. The process required careful positioning, long exposure times, and specific equipment. But try explaining technical limitations to someone who's convinced you violated the natural order of things. Wave 2 was the death ray terror. This panic emerged when people started connecting X-rays to military applications. If invisible rays could pass through solid objects, couldn't they pass through armor, through fortifications, through human bodies in ways that might cause harm? The French newspaper Le Matin published an editorial warning that Röntgen rays might be used to project death at a distance. They imagined invisible weapons that could kill enemies without detection, rays that could penetrate any defense. Military officials in several countries began investigating whether X-rays could be weaponized. This was absurd. My apparatus required enormous amounts of electrical power, produced tiny amounts of radiation, and couldn't be directed with any precision. But military minds, like newspaper editors, are drawn to dramatic possibilities. I received visits from government representatives asking about the military potential of my discovery. I tried to explain that X-rays were a form of electromagnetic radiation, not some sort of directed energy weapon. But when you're dealing with people who don't understand the difference between photography and warfare, scientific explanation becomes very difficult. The fear became so widespread that some European cities considered banning X-ray demonstrations entirely. Public health officials worried about radiation poisoning, which was actually a legitimate concern, though they didn't understand why. I didn't fully understand the biological effects myself at the time. But the most bizarre manifestation of Wave 2 was the emergence of X-ray protection devices. Charlatans began selling mirrors, crystals, and metal amulets that supposedly deflected harmful rays. People carried these talismans as protection against invisible radiation they might encounter anywhere.
One particularly creative fraud in London sold X-ray detecting powder that would allegedly change color when dangerous rays were present. Customers would sprinkle this worthless chemical around their homes and check it daily for signs of invisible contamination.
Wave 3 was the spiritual crisis panic. This was the most fascinating and disturbing reaction of all. Some religious leaders proclaimed that X-rays violated divine will by revealing what God had intended to keep hidden. If the human body was sacred and private, what right did science have to peer inside it? A Catholic bishop in France declared that X-ray photography was an indecent assault upon human dignity and banned it from church-affiliated hospitals. Protestant ministers in America preached sermons about the unholy invasion of divine mystery. But the spiritual panic went beyond religious objections. People began questioning the fundamental nature of reality. If invisible rays could reveal hidden structures in solid objects, what else might be invisible around us? What other forces were secretly penetrating our bodies, our homes, our private thoughts? Spiritualists and mediums had a field day with this anxiety. They claimed X-rays proved the existence of invisible realms, supernatural forces, and spectral presences. If science can see through matter, they argued, surely spirits can move through it as well. I attended one public demonstration where a self-proclaimed psychical researcher used my X-ray photographs as evidence for the existence of souls. He pointed to the skeletal images and claimed they showed the boundary between flesh and spirit. This was complete nonsense, but the audience was fascinated. The irony was overwhelming. I had discovered a perfectly natural form of electromagnetic radiation, but people were using it to justify beliefs in the supernatural. Meanwhile, I was still in my laboratory trying to understand the basic physics of what I had observed, while the world spun fantasies about death rays and spiritual revelations. I was measuring wavelengths and studying atomic interactions. The scientific community thankfully responded more rationally. Physicists around the world began replicating my experiments, confirming my results, and extending the research. Within months, X-ray apparatus was being used in hospitals across Europe and America. The first medical X-ray in the United States was taken in February 1896 at Dartmouth College. A man had broken his arm, and doctors used X-rays to locate the fracture without surgery. This was exactly the kind of practical application I had envisioned. But even medical adoption created new anxieties. Patients worried about the safety of X-ray exposure. Doctors debated the ethics of seeing inside living bodies. Medical schools struggled to incorporate this new technology into their curricula. Some physicians initially refused to use X-rays because they seemed too much like magic. How could invisible forces reveal internal structures? It violated everything they understood about diagnosis and treatment. Others embraced the technology so enthusiastically that they ignored safety precautions entirely. Early radiologists suffered radiation burns, hair loss, and skin damage because no one understood the biological effects of ionizing radiation. I tried to provide guidance based on my own experience, but I didn't fully comprehend the dangers myself. I had spent countless hours with my hands in the X-ray beam during those initial 7 weeks of research. I experienced some skin irritation, but I attributed it to chemical exposure from my photographic work. The tragic irony is that while people feared imaginary dangers from X-rays, death rays, privacy violations, spiritual contamination, they ignored the real danger of radiation exposure. The genuine health risks were completely overshadowed by fantastic fears. By mid-1896, the initial panic was beginning to subside, replaced by more rational discussion of practical applications. Hospitals were installing X-ray equipment. Medical schools were teaching radiological diagnosis. Industrial companies were exploring uses for internal inspection of manufactured goods. But the hysteria had revealed something important about human psychology and the relationship between science and society. First, fear of the unknown spreads faster than understanding of the known. My careful scientific paper took months to be properly comprehended by fellow physicists. But sensational newspaper articles about death rays circulated globally within days. Second, people's imagination fills gaps in their knowledge with their worst fears. Because most people couldn't understand electromagnetic radiation, they invented explanations involving privacy invasion, military weapons, and spiritual violation. Third, new technologies always trigger anxiety about social change. X-rays threatened to establish notions of privacy, modesty, and medical practice. Rather than focusing on potential benefits, many people immediately worried about how the discovery might disrupt their familiar world. Fourth, media sensationalism amplifies public anxiety. Responsible journalism would have explained the actual capabilities and limitations of X-rays. Instead, newspapers competing for readers published increasingly dramatic claims about my discovery. And finally, scientific literacy matters enormously for public policy and social stability. The countries with better science education adapted to X-ray technology more quickly and effectively. Nations where scientific knowledge was limited to elite circles experienced more prolonged periods of panic and resistance. Looking back, I realize I was naive about the social implications of scientific discovery. I thought I was simply publishing interesting observations about electromagnetic radiation. I didn't anticipate that my findings would trigger worldwide anxiety about privacy, warfare, and spiritual contamination. But this experience taught me something crucial about the responsibility that comes with scientific knowledge. It's not enough to make discoveries and publish papers. Scientists must also help society understand and adapt to new knowledge in constructive ways. I began giving public lectures explaining X-rays in accessible language. I demonstrated the equipment to reduce fears about mysterious forces. I worked with physicians to establish safe practices for medical applications. Most importantly, I tried to model scientific thinking for general audiences. I showed them how to distinguish between verified facts and speculative possibilities, between careful measurement and sensational claims, between legitimate concerns and irrational fears. The X-ray panic of 1896 was humanity's first encounter with the social disruption that accompanies revolutionary scientific discoveries. It wouldn't be the last. The same patterns of fear, sensationalism, and gradual acceptance would repeat with atomic energy, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and countless other breakthroughs. Each time, society faces the same challenge: how to harness the benefits of new knowledge while managing the risks and disruptions it creates. The key is education, clear communication, and patience with the natural human tendency to fear what we don't understand. My X-rays eventually saved millions of lives through improved medical diagnosis. They revealed the atomic structure of crystals, leading to advances in materials science and chemistry. They opened new fields of astronomy and physics. They became essential tools for industry, security, and scientific research. But none of those benefits would have been possible if society had remained paralyzed by the initial panic. Progress required moving beyond fear to embrace understanding. The invisible world is full of phenomena that seem impossible until they're explained. Radio waves carry information across vast distances. Quantum mechanics describes reality in ways that violate common sense. Genetic code stores the instructions for life in molecular sequences. Each of these discoveries initially seemed as magical and threatening as X-rays did in 1896, and each required the same patient work of education and demonstration to transform public fear into public benefit. Science doesn't just reveal new facts about the natural world. It challenges us to expand our conception of what's possible, to question our assumptions about reality, and to adapt our societies to accommodate new knowledge. The hysteria that followed my discovery wasn't a failure of human intelligence. It was a natural response to encountering something that didn't fit existing frameworks of understanding. The real test wasn't whether people initially feared X-rays, but whether they eventually learned to use them wisely. And they did. Within a decade, X-ray technology had become routine in hospitals worldwide. Medical students learned radiological diagnosis as a standard part of their education. Patients accepted X-ray examinations as normal medical procedures. The death rays became healing rays. The invisible photography became medical imaging. The violation of privacy became the revelation of hidden injuries and diseases. But the most important lesson from the X-ray panic isn't about technology adoption or scientific communication. It's about human adaptability and the importance of maintaining curiosity in the face of the unknown. Every generation encounters discoveries that seem to threaten everything they thought they knew about reality. The challenge is to respond with investigation rather than panic, with education rather than superstition, with hope rather than fear. The invisible forces that surround you, electromagnetic radiation, gravitational waves, quantum fields, genetic information, are no less remarkable than X-rays seemed in 1895. They're simply familiar now because science has made them comprehensible. Tomorrow someone will discover something new that seems impossible today. When that happens, remember the X-ray panic of 1896. Remember that the most revolutionary discoveries often appear most threatening at first. And remember that the most revolutionary discoveries often appear most threatening at first. And remember that understanding, patience, and careful thinking can transform any death ray into a tool for human flourishing. The invisible world is vast and full of wonders waiting to be discovered. Don't let fear of the unknown prevent you from exploring it.